It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. Joining us, Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
All right. Also joining us is Paris-based TV journalist Ulrike Koltermann, who has not graced us with her presence in too long a time. How are you?
Guten Abend. Very well.
Okay. Gregory Viscusi, reporter for Bloomberg News. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast contributor James Kirchick is a fellow at the Brookings Institute and the author of The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. Does it have a happy ending?
You have to buy the books to find out.
Okay, well, James, in Paris this week, we love visitors, so well, thank you for joining us. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag World This Week. 10 years ago today, the world watched agape as Lehman Brothers collapsed. Hot on the heels of fellow investment bank Bear Stearns, the 150-year-old Wall Street institution had suddenly lost all, and it had become abundantly clear that investors had been flying high without any kind of a parachute. The Great Recession ensued, with banks, insurance companies, and automakers bailed out, interest rates cut to naught, regulations tightened, and crisis coordination that spanned the globe. Most notably, there was the creation, you'll recall, of the G20, a group of nations. The Financial Times lead editorial this Friday, alarming. It warns that the cooperation is waning and says, most notably, discontent is now felt as an us versus them insurgency against political and business elites. The nationalism and protectionism, Gregory Viscusi, ironically chipping away at that cooperation we saw 10 years ago and could make the next crisis worse. You agree?
I mean, certainly, if you look at transatlantic relations now, you'd say that they're not very good, and there's less cooperation. But I think that at the technical level of central banks, which is sort of what matters here, and regulators, I don't think that cooperation is worse now than it was 10 years ago. I don't agree on that front.
Because there's the crisis itself, and we were all caught off guard by it, and then there was the response to the crisis.
I mean, and the trendy thing is to say nothing's changed, we've not learned the lessons. I mean, that's sort of the standard thing people say, but it's a mixed bag. Banks are certainly better capitalized than they were 10 years ago. I do think that regulators and central bankers are more keen, are more keyed into following the risks. On the other hand, there are bubbles out there. Probably not a housing bubble, but I would say the government bond market in a lot of countries is a bit of a bubble. When you've got countries that borrow at 0%, I think that is a bubble. Bitcoin, we saw that bubble. That fortunately wasn't, not that many institutions held Bitcoin, so that wasn't a problem. So it's a mixed bag, but I wouldn't be as doomy as some people have been.
Are you reassured, Jamie, by what Greg is saying?
I actually do agree with him mostly on the analysis of the facts, but it is the political perception that I think is worrying, is that a lot of people don't seem to believe that the elites, the political establishment, the economic establishment can be trusted. And we're seeing this manifest itself in Donald Trump and Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and Marine Le Pen in this country. The rise of democratic socialism in the United States, with multiple candidates running for Congress successfully on this sort of platform.
So that's been the big change. Yeah, politics is very different indeed than it was 10 years ago. And there was this blowback against populism that was felt Wednesday as the European Parliament took the unprecedented step of recommending that the Commission sanction Hungary. Members of the European Parliament invoking what's called Article 7 for the first time. That can lead to the suspension of an EU state's voting rights. This over what Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, himself touts as illiberal democracy, with curbs on the press, the opposition, NGOs, and openly Islamophobic rhetoric. Orban making his defense all about his closed-door immigration policy.
Hungary does not give in to blackmail. Hungary will defend its borders, stop illegal migration, and will defend its rights, if needs be, against you as well.
Is this a big deal, Ulrike Koltermann?
Yeah, definitely, because, at first, sanctions are highly unlikely because Poland is in the same situation. So they already have vowed they will veto further sanctions. So it might not happen, but it's a very strong signal. But it also can boost Orban's popularity at home. His party is at 36%. So it's a strong signal, but it might have a negative effect after all. And then the overall question is if his party will stay in the EPP, the European Popular,
the big center-right
law,
which split terribly over this.
and where also Merkel's CDU is part of it. So there are further questions which are much more important.
And by a 2-to-1 margin, the members of that EPP bloc voted for the sanctions. The German CDU voted for. Those from the more conservative CSU party from Germany abstained.
The French voted against.
Did
No,
we
the
see?
French
And the French
split.
voted
French were all
for.
over
Yeah, the
the
French
place.
voted
were all
for.
over the
voted
place.
for. Are we
split-
seeing actually with this vote that happened Wednesday, maybe symbolic, but sort of a realignment of European politics?
Well, definitely, because the split between left and right seems to be over for a while now. Macron is trying to build his alliance, talking about progressive alliance, and on the other hand, we have the populists. So there's a new split up, and the elections are coming very soon in May.
Vivian Wall?
I mean, I totally agree that, this is not a divide necessarily between left and right. The whole concept in Europe at this point between left and right is very, very complicated and not particularly valid in a lot of countries.
So what is the divide if it's not
The
left versus
divide
right?
is the establishment, i.e. the elite, versus all of those millions who believe, rightly or wrongly, that they don't have a direct say. In fact, they don't have a direct say in who will be, for example, the very top leaders of the EU. They can vote for a party or a candidate in the EU elections next May. But after that, they feel distant from what's happening. And this is being played out in a number of different countries. Italy, where I just was, very strongly. But it's not the only one. I mean, really, all through the country, all through the continent, there's been a kind of expansion, steady expansion, an assumption that the bigger Europe is, the better Europe. And it's an assumption which a lot of people don't buy into anymore.
So this sort of new dichotomy between those who are for and against globalization, where does
I
it?
think that's a really risky trap that we shouldn't fall into. The issue of migration is the one that you saw Viktor Orban talking about. The reason why liberals, small L liberals, people who believe in liberal democracy, the EU Commission, the reason why we should all have a problem with Viktor Orban is not his views on immigration. Because you know what? The vast majority, or maybe 60% of Europeans agree with Viktor Orban on immigration.
including
they don't want
Macron's
it.
voters.
They don't want it.
Yeah.
And you know what? Being in favor of a restrictive immigration policy doesn't make you a liberal Democrat. That's a policy that people in democracies should be able to debate and argue about, whether it's in my country or Hungary or Germany. The reason why we have a problem with Viktor Orban is because he's attacking checks and balances, the independence of the judiciary, the freedom of the press. He's going after the Central European University. Those are all problems why Hungary is now becoming a threat to democracy. And I feel that the more he's attacked for his migration policies, the more we play into his narrative. And it's going to be easier for him to rally his own supporters and also for him to get the support of people across Europe. Because you know what? When it comes to migration, more people agree with Viktor Orban in Europe than they do Chancellor Merkel.
And we saw it play out on Wednesday. The rule of law arguments were put to him, and he was responding with immigration. That was his...
I think Jamie makes a good point. I think that where the rubber hits the road in Europe has been the issue of immigration. And the past 3 years has been sort of a very, very stark conflict over the biggest migration crisis since the Second World War. But what it's allowed is for right-wing populists like Orban, Matteo Salvini in Italy, etc., the list goes on, to seize on this one issue, which, as Jamie says, has broad support, which is let's get this migration policy of Europe, which is a complete mess, under control. And they've allowed it. They've allowed people like Viktor Orban to rise to positions of great power.
if we talk about immigration in Europe, we have to consider that actually the figures are going down. The fear of the
Absolutely.
people is getting bigger and bigger, especially true for Germany, but also Europe overall. Immigration, it is not the core issue anymore, but it's immigrants are still being scapegoated in several countries, and that's the main issue.
But it's the core rallying cry. Of
There's
course,
still
yeah.
there's still a lot of people who need to be integrated. They're not being integrated in many of these societies, and also this is a long-term issue. If you look at the size of population growth in Africa, where there's going to be 1 billion more people added by 2040 or whatever the number is. If you look at the political instability in the Middle East, which is ongoing, there are going to be further migration waves to Europe. So people know that this is going to be coming down the line, and it's a question of how do you deal with it? Because if we see a repeat of 2015 with over 1 million, 1.5 million people coming into Europe, then you can say hello to President Le Pen and the AfD and government in Germany and more countries leaving the EU.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but I think that at a certain point, the French will not vote in a President
it comes
Le Pen.
back to this dichotomy. Because there are those who feel strongly one side or the other, but what about those in the middle, Gregory Viscusi?
Middle in what sense?
In the sense of on this argument are not so impassioned.
But I think you have to look at what the positions are of each country. I mean, we see Macron as being sort of the liberal on this issue, and we see Salvini as sort of, hard right. Can you tell me the difference between Salvini and Macron's immigration policies?
He sent the vote to
There
Spain.
isn't. There isn't a difference. They have the exact same migration policy. So it's all a question of positioning. It's all a question. It's
Branding?
positioning and branding.
In your cover story interview with Italy's far-right leader, Vivian Walt, the Deputy Prime Minister, Matteo Salvini, Time magazine describes on the cover the Lega Party leader as an immigration czar on a mission to undo the EU. Is that really what he wants? To undo the EU?
Can I first say I don't write the cover slides? I know that's a cop-out, but it happens to be true. And it went through various stages before it reached that one. I did ask Salvini. I said, well, why are you trying to take the EU apart? He said, no, on the contrary. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to save the EU. And that history will show that we have
Which you could
saved
say,
the EU and brought it back to its Judeo-Christian roots.
which is the same discourse as the leaders of Poland and Hungary. They don't want to leave the EU.
Well, what's so interesting is that the whole issue, and this has changed so much in the last year, the whole issue of an exit, I think, is really over, at least for now. You don't hear these leaders say that. And his whole line to me in the interview was, we're going to change things from within. And that's a much more subversive prospect, actually, than simply bailing out.
I think we were talking earlier about divides, and one of the divides is where are problems best solved? Are they best solved at the European level with governments thrashing out common policies in Brussels, or are they best solved at the national level? And people like Salvini and Le Pen say everything should be settled at the national level. I mean, it's probably a little late for a lot of these big global problems to be solved at the national level of European countries, but that is one of the big divides.
What is really frightening is that Salvini seems to be like the European Trump. I mean, they met before Trump became president. He met Steve Bannon, and he has the same slogan, Italians first. And as Vivian rightly said, he could be one of the leading politicians in Europe.
And he's not the only one who met Steve Bannon. You sat down with him.
Well, he did speak to us for this story, yes. And I mean, that is an interesting question. I mean, Steve Bannon is, love him or hate him, he's an extremely smart operator, and he has set his sights on the EU elections for next May. Salvini was his first big recruit, but he's got a lot still to come, I would think.
And what is his... we know that Steve Bannon likes disruption, but what does he want politically when he gives advice to Matteo Salvini, or he shows up?
They want to break up the EPP. They want to break up the big parties that essentially, run the kind of architecture of the EU. And it all seems very abstract to those, even to those of us who live in Europe, and certainly to those of, outside of Europe. But in fact, the stakes are pretty high. You could, if you actually in some way realign for the first time in many, many years who, the major parties who control EU decision-making, then that's a pretty powerful thing you can do.
Just a footnote, but he's also talking to the Catholic Church, at least to some right-wing institutions. But that means he's really trying to gather a lot of.
Well, he seems
alliance.
to have two tracks. He definitely wants to get rid of Francis. There's no question about that. But he does seem to keep that separate from his political activities. There does seem to be two. He doesn't seem to mix the two.
He's a pseudo-intellectual and a self-promoter, and I would really, caution people to sort of
Not
take a
take
step
him
back.
too
And well, I just think this is a man. This is a man who's a big talker.
And the European
isn't it
parties
fa-
haven't rushed. They've not rushed
No.
to have him. I mean, the National Front in France does not want much to do with him. Salvini's kind of a guy who, if you come along, he'll slap you on the back and have a beer with you. But I wouldn't read too much into this.
And this is a guy who was so intelligent and crafty that he thought it'd be a good idea to attack the president of the United States' daughter and son-in-law publicly, and that would somehow, ensure his future with President Trump. So he's not, he's not the smartest guy.
But the strategy of disruption works. And let me just ask you, there is this sense, since this awkward coalition government came to be in Italy between the anti-establishment Five-Star movement and Salvini's League, that, even
Well,
though
in
he's
some ways-
on paper, he's the junior partner, did you have the sense that you were actually talking to the leader of Italy?
Oh, there's no question about it. And I'm sure Greg would say the same thing. Nobody doubts who runs Italy. I mean, on paper, he's the interior minister, he's the deputy prime minister. But, I mean, he's the guy if you're, a foreign leader or whomever, and you show up in Rome wanting to see the most powerful person in the country, you go see Matteo Salvini.
He's the most powerful. When he runs Italy, he's had to back off on a lot of things. I mean, he's lost some battles with the prime minister and with the finance minister.
I'm not sure anyone runs Italy.
Yeah, exactly. No, but it's not meant to be run. The whole Italian system is designed not to have one person who runs it. That's the whole point of the Italian system.
But look at the polls. He's
So,
at 30% now, which
Excuse
is
me?
he's at 30%.
He's rising in the
League.
polls, yes. So, I mean, the whole question is, does he want not to run Italy, but to bring down the government and go to elections so that he can not be the junior partner in the next election? But, if he brings down this government, you can say goodbye to another coalition government with 5 stars, so he'd have to look for allies elsewhere. So he probably is not in his interest to bring down the government and hold elections right now.
And this upheaval that we've seen with the public debt crisis, the prolonged recession, the migration crisis in Italy, it's really changed the political landscape in that country.
Well, it certainly meant that a country that used to be one of the more pro-European Union countries is now one of the least pro-European Union countries. I mean, that's probably been the most notable change in Italy if you looked at it from 10, 15 years ago.
And I think also it's kind of united, and again, Greg would be the kind of Italy expert here, but it's certainly united North and South. The Lega, which is Salvini's party, used to be a northern autonomous party and is no longer. It's now appealed to national.
Yeah, but they still didn't. They didn't get the big breakthrough in the South. They exist in the South, whereas they didn't even used to exist at all. But they didn't get their base of their vote is still in the North.
All right, when we come back,
5-star in the South.
We're going to see how it's all playing out in Ulrike Koldermann's Germany. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Vivian Wall, Paris correspondent for Time magazine, is with us, as is Paris-based television journalist Ulrike Koldermann. Gregory Viscusi, reporter for Bloomberg News, and a visitor in town, Jamie Kirchick, the author of The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. It's not an uplifting tale, is it?
There's not a lot of uplifting things going on in the world right now. So,
all right, well, let's find out. We've been talking about Italy, which illustrates that Europe's battle of values is not just East versus West. It's not just a showdown over rule of law. Recent clashes in the East German city of Chemnitz has not only led to neo-Nazis beating up foreigners in the streets, it's also sparking now a crisis within Angela Merkel's ruling coalition. Last weekend, her domestic intelligence chief, Hans-Georg Maassen, gave an interview to the country's largest selling tabloid newspaper, Bild, where he doubted the authenticity of media reports of right-wing extremist foreigner hunts in Chemnitz, adding it could be a distraction from what sparked it all, the murder of a German by foreigners. The ruling CDU blasting the remarks, the chancellor, who Wednesday denounced racism and intolerance in a speech before parliament. But her junior coalition partners are split. The Social Democrats want Maaßen out. The Bavarian conservative CSU, which holds the interior ministry, they'd like to keep him.
It is our opinion that there are at least doubts whether or not he is the right person to be head of the Domestic Intelligence Service.
Hat umfassend und aus meiner Sicht überzeugend dargelegt.
He has comprehensively, as I see it, convincingly presented his way of proceeding. He convincingly refuted some conspiracy theories, and I also want to add that he, again and again, has convincingly taken a position against far-right extremism. I have known him for a while now, and it was important to him to have repeated it yesterday so clearly and distinctly.
Yeah, he said he didn't mean for those remarks to be blown out of proportion. I accept what he says. Should we take it at face value, or is Horst Seehofer, the interior minister, picking a fight with the chancellor?
It's it's quite surprising that he is still in power. I mean, after this incident,
Maaßen,
the head of the interior intelligence service, there would have been enough reasons to fire him, but Seehofer, the interior minister, tries to protect him, and most probably because they have the same political agenda, which is also shocking because in his job he shouldn't have a political agenda. So it's quite a difficult situation for Germany because Germans are actually losing confidence in the institutions.
We talked before the break about the obsession with checks and balances in the Italian system. Germany's the same, where rule of law is something that matters a lot. What does public opinion think about all this?
I think most people are shocked that this is going on for so long. I mean, Seehofer sacked the head of the migration agency this summer for much less, and this person is still in power. And just a footnote, but he wrote his PhD thesis about migration in the end of the 90s, and he already talked about uncontrolled mass immigration. That means it's a certain set of mind, which he shares most probably with Seehofer. That might be the main reason why he is still in power.
So the SPD wants him out. The CDU is angry. Why does he still have a job?
Well, Merkel is sort of a lame duck. She cannot really react. It's weird because it's contradictory. It's her last mandate, so she should be even freer to do things. But she seems to be very much paralyzed by the whole situation. She took a long while to react. She reacted with very strong words, but she's not acting as Germans are expecting it from her.
Vivian Walt?
I mean, from the outside, it's certainly she is sort of behaving, as Ulrike says, as a leader without the kind of clout that she needs. Of course, any powerful leader would just fire somebody. I mean, Donald Trump would probably fire somebody like that. And yet she hasn't, and she seems hesitant.
But that's not the Merkel method. We know her now. She doesn't do bravado.
No, she does not. But even for her, she appears cautious and hesitant, and possibly because popular mood is not on her side.
Jamie Kirchick?
I'm going to dissent a little bit here from the consensus. What Maaßen said was that he didn't doubt the authenticity of the video. He doubted whether or not it was actually a video taken on the day that these riots took place. The video was posted by some anonymous, extreme left-wing Antifa organization. And he basically said, let's wait until we can actually verify that this video was taken on August 28th at this particular location, and it wasn't from months ago or a year before. And I would also say this is something that should also factor into any conversation here, which is that, Maaßen is a very strong vocal critic of Russia and the disinformation efforts that they've been launching in Germany over the past couple of years. And I'm sure it was in the back of his mind, as it should be in the back of all our minds, that this is an issue, the migration issue, which the Russians are very keen to exploit. And the possibility that the Russians might be faking videos of either far-right people attacking migrants or migrants attacking, native Germans is not beyond the realm of possibility. And I think we will see that in the future. And so I'm sure that was something in his mind as well, that maybe this video could have been produced by a foreign hostile intelligence service. So I think that there was just a real rush to judgment to condemn him. And the SPD and the Greens are playing politics with this.
I disagree. Sorry, but he is
nothing wrong with disagreeing.
He had no point in giving that interview without even informing the chancellor. That's not his job.
But the chancellor had made remarks about a hunt for migrants without even consulting him or the domestic intelligence service first.
But the thing is, it's not his job to do this kind of interview because he didn't give any proof for his point. He still has no proof. And meanwhile, the authenticity is nearly proved. So the effect of what he did is that Germans are losing confidence in the institutions, and that is really dangerous.
All right, the other story that came out this week, and it's actually perhaps a watershed moment for France. 61 years after the disappearance of a 25-year-old French communist militant during the Battle of Algiers, the crackdown on the insurrection during Algeria's War of Independence, France's president went to the home Thursday of Maurice Audin's 87-year-old widow to deliver a letter, one that admits, yes, the young mathematician was tortured and killed by the French military. Emmanuel Macron acknowledging the role of the French state in atrocities committed during Algeria's bloody fight for independence.
The children were all asleep, and during the night, there was a knock on the door. They'd come for my husband. They took him away, and then we never saw him again.
Josette Audin, who raised those children alone, never remarried. Is it a watershed moment?
It's totally. I mean, it's maybe not quite on par with Chirac admitting the responsibility of the French state in the World War II deportations of Jews, but it's close enough to it because it's the first time that the French a French official of that high, you can't go any higher, saying that systematic torture was used and condoned by French authorities. It's interesting though that he's done this in a case involving a French person. That this guy was French. He was part of the French settler community, but he was part of the anti-colonial struggle. Obviously, hundreds of thousands of Algerians died in that war. But so maybe this is a first step towards that. I mean, the Algerians have been asking for a long time for an official apology for France. Sarkozy and Hollande, previous presidents, have certainly said that crimes were committed. It was a horrible war. It was a terrible war, but they never went as far as Macron went this time.
First step was exactly the terms that were employed by the Veterans Affairs Minister of Algeria when he was asked.
It's irrefutable proof that the matters in which both parties are interested have been followed closely and truly moved forward. And we need to bring up the matter of those people who disappeared, to open up the archives and discuss repatriating the skulls of martyrs too.
Vivian Wall.
I mean, the fact that it's taken 60 years is really quite shocking, actually. And if you remember, Macron actually called this a crime against humanity during the presidential campaign, and he immediately had to walk back his remarks because he faced such opprobrium for having used that term.
How do you explain this? Because what was it, 4 years after the United States left Vietnam, you had the Academy Award-winning movie Coming Home. It was something that everyone talked about.
Well, I was just going to say, it's never been
61 years. There's been a few movies, there's been a few books, but it's not something that's openly discussed, something that's brought out in the open. Why?
And also, there was never the kind of generational revolution that you had as you did among Americans against the Vietnam War.
I think it's still a very sensitive issue. In France, it's a taboo. Nobody's speaking about it. Yeah. It's not really taught in schools. There are not many memorials.
Because it nearly brought this country to civil war. In fact,
I think
we got a new constitution.
As divisive as the Vietnam War for the US, definitely. but there was much less talking about it, and it's only now that he also announced that they will open the archives, which is a very important step. That means also they were closed so far, so there was no real work on it.
You can't really compare to Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam was a foreign country that the U.S. sent troops to. Algeria was a place where there was a European settler community that had lived there for generations, and millions of them left after independence. It was an extremely brutal civil war with extremely brutal war of independence with horrible atrocities on both sides. Those million or so European settlers that moved to France have been a lobby ever since. I mean, you can't go anywhere in France without meeting someone who's descendant from the European settler community. I say European because they weren't all French. A lot of them were Italian, Maltese, Spanish, other nationalities. But it's a case that there was massive amounts of suffering on all sides.
And they are still alive. There are many veterans.
There
are still the Pieds Noirs, the children of.
And yet it is really sort of too late to have real judicial redress for people who might be now found, now that the archives are being opened finally. You can actually for the first time, maybe identify people who are guilty of,
and it might
crimes against humanity.
It might be easier for Macron because he's the first president who was born after the war. So that makes a difference.
It makes a difference, and he was very careful in the wording of what he wrote. He alluded to a 1956 statute that effectively allowed extrajudiciary arrests, saying it was the responsibility of the state in this instance and not of the military, making sure, Jamie Kirchhoff, that he didn't blame it on soldiers, but on the state as a whole. That approach has the French military a little uneasy because they feel like whatever happens, they're going to be made to be the scapegoat.
It seems very legalistic and almost sort of technocratic way of working around it. But France hasn't really had the same sort of historical reckoning, I think, with Algeria that, say, Germans have very admirably, I think, with the Holocaust in World War II. But it's a very difficult thing to do, and it was very difficult for German leaders to do after World War II because they felt that they didn't want to implicate the entire society. They needed to get people together to struggle against communism. So I think there's probably lessons that the French could learn from their neighbors on this.
And he was definitely more careful than before because during his campaign, he already talked about Algeria, and he said that colonization in Algeria was like a crime against humanity, and that sparked a huge debate while he was still campaigning. So this time he chose to proceed in a more careful way.
I mean, that said, it is in the context also of him being under tremendous, criticism for the way he's handled the arrests against suspected terrorists. There's a lot of talk about the fact that Muslim French have been really the target in the last few years of the state of emergency laws, which are now pretty much permanent laws. And some of that has happened under Macron. So I'm not sort of completely letting him off the hook on this issue, I would say. And
he sees it as a vote-getter, and that's the other issue, which is that after the Algerians fight this bloody war of independence, and afterwards, when they need to go look for a job, have to come to France in many instances.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And, the unemployment gap is still, really, remarkable, actually, in France.
I think it's also a strong signal to the other ex-colonies because they still have a difficult relationship, and talking finally about the Algerian war might make it easier also to handle other issues concerning colonialization, for instance, artworks in French museums. So there's a huge issue that he's only starting to...
He's opened a can of worms, you're saying.
I think so.
But Algeria really is a special case because there were French Algerians. They were not French Congolese or French Senegalese or French, it is a different issue.
We're also going to be talking, before we go, about the price of eggs and vegetables in Hong Kong. It's doubled at local markets. That's because, they're fearing Typhoon Mangkhut. It's yet to hit the Philippines, but it's already got everyone potentially in its path, taking precautions and stocking up. By the way, Hong Kong is not in the eye of the storm, but still, that super typhoon is making its way across the Pacific, while Hurricane Florence batters the Carolina coast. Yes, it's no longer a Category 4 storm, but the deluge is impressive. The floodwater is expected to keep rising for another 24 hours. And gosh, at this point, Jamie Kirchick, we kind of know the drill as journalists, because all the teams get ready, go down to wherever it is. We have our team in Wilmington, North Carolina right now. We're well versed because it's more and more these extreme weather incidents. Last year, you had 2 major hurricanes in the United States.
Well, they just declared in advance of this storm. Is it Florence? I lose track. Is that the one? Where I'm from, Washington, D.C., the municipality declared in advance a 15-day state of emergency, although now it turns out that the storm isn't even going to hit Washington, D.C.
Half a million homes without power, though.
In the Carolinas.
In the
yes.
Carolinas.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. I don't know how to stop it from happening. But I'd probably be a lot richer if I did. But
all right. Well, in preparing for the hurricane, there were, as you say, lots of warnings and people taking all these precautions. They're all haunted by Hurricane Katrina a decade ago in Louisiana, where there perhaps weren't enough precautions taken. Donald Trump managing to make it about last year's hurricane that killed 3,000 in Puerto Rico. The U.S. president denying that revised toll and blaming it on the Democrats, saying that this was made to make me look as bad as possible when I was successfully raising billions, capital B, dollars, capital D, to help rebuild Puerto Rico. If a person died for any reason, like old age, just add him onto the list. Bad politics. I love Puerto Rico! ! When he tweets stuff like that, is it a tactic?
I'm curious why he has this German tendency to capitalize now.
now.
It's really weird. He does that in most of his tweets.
He's from German descent.
That could be it. His tweets read better in the original German. So.
But why is he picking a fight with Puerto Rico, with San Juan's mayor, the mayor of Puerto Rico's capital?
I mean, he can't take a slight or a criticism without giving back.
But he started that.
He starts most of them. Yeah, I know. Look, it'd be great if we had a president who didn't resort to these sorts of things, but
here he is tossing the...
tossing the paper towels.
Tossing the paper towels. Gregory Viscusi, your thoughts on this, on the sort of crisis management in the United States?
U.S. gets a lot of hurricanes. I mean, there's no way around that. It's on a hurricane path, and they get a lot of hurricanes. I mean, probably some of these could have been dealt with better, I'm sure. But it's a problem we thankfully don't have to deal with here in Europe as much.
I checked the figures. There were 17 hurricanes last year, and they cost the American economy about $200 billion. So that means even if you cannot blame one single hurricane on climate change, but the average number is getting higher and higher, and even Donald Trump cannot deny that.
The numbers are getting higher and higher, Vivian Wald. We had those devastating forest fires in California this summer. They burnt up, the equivalent of twice the area of New York City.
I was there, as a matter of fact, yeah.
But here's the question. Last week, we were talking about Sweden on this set, and how, because there were big forest fires there, it changed the conversation. In the build-up to the general election, the far right didn't do as well. The Greens did better. And it really became a campaign issue. We're heading towards the midterms in the United States. This doesn't seem to be an issue at all, despite the billions mentioned there by Ulrike Kolderman.
I'm not sure about that.
It ranks very low on voter preference.
Yeah, because Sweden has never had forest fires. The U.S. has hurricanes. We always have had hurricanes.
But why isn't this more of an issue?
There's a lot of skepticism as to the link between greenhouse gas production and climate change among voters. I mean, there's just a lot of skepticism. I'm not saying it's justified or not, but a lot of people in the United States don't necessarily draw the connection. And also when it's put to them, this is what you have to do or this is what we're telling you that you have to do to fix climate change. A lot of people don't want to give up air conditioning or, gas guzzling cars and all the amenities of a modern life.
So is the answer just build more levees in low-lying areas? Don't change the zoning, but sort of try to adapt a little bit?
I think it's a mixture of taking policies aimed at mitigating, like you just said, and also, longer term, going to green energy, using technologies to do. I mean, I think we need to do a mix of policies, but just kind of, moving back to the Stone Age, I don't think is one of them.
I think there is some good news. The summit in San Francisco ending today means that if national governments are not doing what they are supposed to do, then the big cities can take the lead. Yeah. And there's a lot happening.
Governors are taking
so
the lead.
They just announced that there are
obviously
27 big cities that actually peaked. So the greenhouse emissions are not increasing anymore, which is really good news. Bad news is that they are all not in the developing world. So there's still a lot to be done, but things are happening.
Yeah, the bad news as well is that here in France, where since 2015 and we signed on to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, instead of dropping, we found out that carbon emissions are now up 6.7% in that time. That green line you see on the screen, that's what was the target, and this is what has actually happened. There's construction and a spike in the sale of gas-guzzling big cars that are the difference there. It's funny because around the world, Emmanuel Macron is seen as the champion who says, let's make the planet great again.
Have you noticed one policy in France about carbon? I haven't.
But it's ironic because in the United States, I believe greenhouse gas emissions are declining.
But because
in the U.S. is attacked a lot. And
I think in the U.S. it's a purely economic thing that coal is no longer viable, but gas is, and so there's been a shift. The French have always thought they didn't have to do anything because most of their electricity comes from nuclear, which has other environmental issues, but carbon is not one of them. And so the French have always felt doesn't involve us, and so they've never. I can't think of a single.
So hang on, you were telling us earlier how Macron and Salvini have the same immigration policy. Are you saying that Macron and Trump have the same climate change policy?
It's definitely not that's a tough
They have a lot more. They have a lot more in common than most people realize.
He just changed the environment minister and took someone who is sort of opportunistic. That's a signal. I mean, climate change is not high on Macron's agenda.
It's undoubtable that the French are driving bigger and bigger cars. That's, one only has to live in Paris for a while to notice that.
So is that the fault of the politicians or is that our fault? Are we all schizophrenic? Because this environment minister who quit, Nicolas Hulot, was his most popular cabinet member. So on the one hand, we like the concept of things being green.
Oh, it's great.
But we also like big cars?
It makes people feel great to say, well, we're supporting, reining in global warming, and it makes people feel good. The real problem is that, and it's exactly what Jamie was saying, when it comes down to it, you're not prepared to change your own lifestyle in some dramatic way in order to make that happen. We can see some of the initiatives in Paris have not gone too well. For example, closing off roads, simply created massive traffic jams elsewhere. It's not like people suddenly decided, well, I'd rather, ride a bicycle.
It's moving in a good direction because Paris will be car-free once per month from now on, which is great.
Yeah.
But does that make a difference, though?
It does make a difference in the head.
Of course, the next step, if you really want to go the whole hog on this, would be a congestion tax, which I know.
Look, Paris is the only city I know in Europe that does nothing against cars entering it. I mean, there's, the city centers of any town in Germany and Italy are largely car-free. They're mostly pedestrian. London has a congestion charge. Paris, nothing. Yeah.
We'll leave it there, but I want to thank you very much. Gregory Viscusi, Vivian Walter, Jamie Kirchick, Ulrika Kolterman. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.